Today we're going to be taking a look at the recently released firmware updates for the very popular MSI 27-inch and 32-inch QD-OLED monitors, which we reviewed recently. At the start of May, MSI published a new firmware for their MPG271QRX and their MPG321URX models, which offers a wide range of improvements, updates and bug fixes. Some of these are in direct response actually to feedback that we gave MSI after we'd reviewed their screens, based on suggestions we had, things we'd spotted, or things that you, our audience, had told us about. So thanks to everyone for providing feedback and thoughts, and bravo to MSI for listening and publishing what is one of the most extensive firmware updates for any monitor that we've actually ever seen. MSI sent us both screens back out so that we could take a look at the firmware update process and test some of the improvements and fixes for ourselves. It's actually dead easy to update the firmware, but you're going to need to install MSI's gaming intelligence software, which is a hefty 500 meg file download. So that's going to take a little bit of time. You also need to connect your display back to your PC using the provided USB-A to USB-B cable, so that the two can then communicate with one another, and the software will then tell you once it's connected and ready to go. With the gaming intelligence software installed, why not also download our best settings configuration file for each screen to quickly and easily load up and select if you want. Those are available in the description below. You can check which firmware version you currently have installed on the screen in the bottom right hand corner of the menu. You can then download the latest firmware from MSI support pages. We've provided links to both of those in the description below. The new firmware is version 10, with the monitors coming out of the factory previously with either version 8 or 9 installed depending on the model. Some newer stock may already have version 10 firmware, so do check that from your on-screen menu before you decide to upgrade anything. The firmware files themselves are under 1 meg in size, so they're quick and easy to download. Download the firmware file and unzip it somewhere on your desktop. To install the firmware, you have to go into the Gaming Intelligence software, press the little gear icon at the top right, then you need to select the Scaler button in the firmware update section. Take note of the warnings and then hit Next to proceed. You can select your file from there and then just press Update and it will do its thing. The actual update takes around 9 minutes in total, and at the end you're asked to unplug and replug the AC power cable from the monitor. Afterwards you should see the new version 10 firmware listed in the bottom right of the on-screen menu, and you're all done. Let's have a look at the excellent set of updates one by one. Firstly, there's a new switch in the menu to disable DSC or display stream compression if you want to. That will significantly limit the available bandwidth of the screen, so you will have to take a hit when it comes to refresh rate or perhaps resolution or color depth. But with DSC disabled, that will now allow you to use NVIDIA DSR and DLDSR upscaling if you want to. Features that were not available before when DSC would always be used and operating above the limits of those features. That applied even if you had manually lowered your refresh rate as well. Disabling DSC may also be useful to those with multi-monitor setups, which sometimes behave oddly with DSC enabled, and it will help eliminate some other annoyances like black screens when alt-tabbing from games that some people experience. With DSC disabled and DisplayPort connection being used, you can run the 32-inch model at 4K resolution and a maximum refresh rate of 120Hz, but you are forced down to a 6-bit color depth in that situation. If you lower your refresh rate, you can run at 4K 60Hz but at 10-bit color depth. Or you can drop to a low resolution like 1440p or 1080p and select up to 120Hz and 10-bit color depth support fine there. If your graphics card supports HDMI 2.1 output, you can reach up to 4K and 120Hz at 10-bit color depth, as there's more bandwidth available over that connection, even without DSC being used. With DSC disabled, you can run the 27-inch model at its native 1440p resolution and 240Hz maximum refresh rate, but again over DisplayPort you have to drop to a 6-bit color depth for that. If you use HDMI 2.1, you can select 10-bit color depth at 240Hz instead. You may be able to force higher refresh rates using custom resolution tools, but this is likely to be a bit hit and miss and not something officially supported, so attempt that at your own risk. A lot of users have been asking for this, especially to allow an increased 4K resolution on the 27-inch model in preference over frame rates, and to also support and enhance some older games which don't have native 4K and high resolution support anyway. They've also added an HDMI mode switch in the menu for the 27-inch model, with options available for PC and console. The default is PC, but if you switch to the console mode, it triggers the EDID support for virtual 4K resolutions, which are then actually visible even within Windows as shown here. You can see 4K at 120Hz now visible in the graphics card control panel that wasn't visible before in the PC mode. You don't need this for PC usage, but it may help with compatibility with some games consoles potentially. We didn't have any problems even on the old firmware for an Xbox Series X when selecting 4K on 120Hz, so this fix may be aimed more at PlayStation 5. If you do have any issues with selecting appropriate resolutions and refresh rates from your games console, you can switch to this mode in the menu now anyway. Some new screen size simulation modes have been added to the image section of the on-screen menu as well. So there's now options for a 24.5 inch and a 27 inch size screen on the larger 32 inch model, and an option for a 24.5 inch simulation on the smaller 27 inch screen. This allows you to play games on a smaller size screen simulation if you prefer, which might be useful for those who play competitively, or perhaps to those who are used to a smaller screen area to focus on in those situations. When you use these modes, it only takes a second or so to switch over, and the screen resolution remains set as it was and fills up the new smaller screen area. This is located in the centre of the screen, by the way, with black borders around all four sides. You can't change this position at all, there's no options to move it. You can then change the resolution to something more appropriate for the new screen area, like 1080p or 1440p perhaps, although this won't offer exact one-to-one pixel mapping in those modes, as there's more pixels within those screen areas than this. So you do have to live with a less sharp image, but it shouldn't look too bad at all for gaming and multimedia, and running the screen at a lower resolution will allow you to prioritise frame rates and graphics card detail for those games as well if you want. They've now fixed the preset mode mapping so that you no longer have to choose a single mode for use in both SDR and HDR. Previously, if you'd wanted to use, let's say, the sRGB colour space emulation for SDR work, when you then switch to the HDR input signal, that same preset mode would actually carry across, which you obviously didn't want for HDR content. That's based on a wider colour space, so you don't want sRGB emulation active. With this new version 10 firmware, SDR and HDR modes can have their own preset mode remembered. You can follow our best settings video linked in the description below for recommendations on configuration for SDR, as there's a couple of approaches you might want to take there. But for HDR, we would suggest using the user preset mode, which operates at the screen's native full gamut. One interesting new addition is what MSI have labelled as a fix for image flicker when VRR is enabled. It isn't possible to fully eliminate VRR flicker on OLED panels due to the way that they operate, and it's a fundamental challenge here, but whether or not you experience it is really going to depend on a lot of factors, including your system, your game, your settings, and frame rates. User reports online suggest that there have been some improvements to in-game flicker, although some comment that it's still evident on darker loading screens especially. The consensus across lots of users seems to be that there's been some improvement though here, which is always good news. Also related to gaming is what MSI refer to as input lag and latency optimization. We've tested the lag on both models and got the following results. We need to make a correction here actually to the 60Hz figure for the 32-inch model. In our original review, which has now been updated to correct this, we had accidentally muddled up the photos capturing the 60Hz lag with a batch from the 240Hz measurements. This had led to an incorrect figure for 60Hz unfortunately, which we would like to apologise for. We retested both screens again before and after the firmware update, and the results remained pretty much the same for both screens, with less than half a millisecond in total display lag at the native refresh rates for both screens. This reconfirms the results on the 27-inch model, by the way, which we've received a lot of questions about due to higher figures being measured on other sites. Remember also that it's this figure that applies to VRR gaming as well, and both screens have super low lag for competitive gaming in these situations and at their native refresh rates. Another update that we specifically asked for based on user feedback is a new option in the on-screen display menu to disable the power LED if you want. That can be useful if you want to game in a dark room and avoid distractions from that light. That works as expected, and it's good to see this as an additional option in the menu now. They've also added a fix to address an occasional visual glitch that was occurring sometimes on the 27-inch model, where you might get some small white lines towards the edges of the screen while running at the native 2560 by 1440 resolution and the maximum 360Hz refresh rate. This didn't seem to happen for lower refresh rates, but we had some detailed feedback from our audience and fed this back to MSI for investigation. Our own testing suggests that this has now been fixed, and reading around user reports online and checking with those who'd originally flagged the issues to us suggests that it's also addressed the problem nicely. There's a couple of other updates, including some optimization to the languages in the menu and fixing an abnormal dark screen behavior after VRR was switched, which we hadn't seen ourselves but which seemed to behave fine in our testing. Finally, they've also optimized the behavior of the panel protect feature, which would previously turn the monitor off when it had finished. So if you shut down your PC and your screen went into standby, the panel protect cycle might run, and then at the end it would turn the monitor off fully. That meant an annoying extra press of the monitor's power button when you next turned your PC on. After the update, the screen reverts to whatever state it was in before the panel refresh. So in this example, it would go back to the standby mode again. That makes life easier, and it's less annoying now when the cycle needs to run. So there you go, there's lots of new updates and fixes in the new firmware, and big well done to MSI for listening to their users and making lots of great updates available. One remaining issue is the EOTF tracking in the HDR Peak 1000 mode that we've investigated in detail recently, and we flagged that back to MSI already. They tell us that they're looking into this issue, so hopefully there may be another firmware update at some point if they do manage to make some improvements there. We've got reviews of loads of their new 2024 OLED monitors linked below, as well as the 2 screens covered in this video, so do check those out if you want to know a lot more. Hit subscribe if you'd like to stay up to date on future monitor news, reviews and other content. Thank you for watching, we'll catch you next time.